Hello and good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us today as we speak to Kartik Nair and Vibhushan Subba about horror in Bombay cinema. In our discussion today, the Spectral Archive, Bombay Horror and its Afterlife, Kartik and Vibhushan will consider the art and afterlives of horror films from the 1980s, the palimpsestic histories contained within the spectral images of Bombay horror, and how popular images can be read as archives of their production, regulation, and circulation. The discussion will also consider recent scholarship and writing on horror cinema from India, including Kartik's book Seeing Things. Seeing Things is about the sudden cuts, botched makeup effects, continuity errors, and celluloid damage found in these movies. Reading the Bombay horror film industry from its inception in the 1970s until its decline in the 1990s, bracketed between a post-independence golden era and the current form of global culture industry that is Bollywood. Kartik reads such failures not just as a failure of the films, but of the production of history itself, as clues to the conditions in which the films were made, censored, and seen, offering a view from below of the world's largest film culture. A materialist aesthetics of cinema has allowed for many films, both popular and of specific genres such as the Bombay horror, to be informed by the codes of censorship, budgets or their lack thereof, and a dismissal of the form oftentimes. Some of these concerns overlap in the previous writings or concerns at ASAP. Despite the presence of the alternative as is seen in our name, we are equally intrigued and often write or think about the ways in which popular images and image making informs and is informed by its socio-cultural and political realms. To consider the expanded archive of cinema, then, is to also closely read the film as an archive itself. Here we consider a filmic archive of failures and the material conditions behind its production, the physical forms of censorship, the wear and tear that leaves its traces onto the film itself. While the production of Bombay horror may have dissipated and there may be an onslaught of quote-unquote Bollywood, they are far from disappearing. A sustained afterlife of perhaps once forgotten but cultic films now exist as bootlegged copies uploaded onto video sharing platforms. The fandom around cult films informing individual and often amateur efforts to sustain and grow cinephilia around these films. Through our discussion today, we hope that a consideration for the discarded, the junk, and under-considered histories of filmic past continue to inform our present engagement with the forms. While most of us in our audience need no introduction to them, I will briefly introduce our speakers for the evening. Kartik Nair is a professor of film studies at Temple University in Philadelphia. He has a PhD in cinema studies from New York University and an MPhil in cinema studies from the School of Arts and Aesthetics, Jawaharlal Nehru University, where he began researching 1980s horror cinema. His first book, Seeing Things, which came out earlier this year, explores the production, censorship, and circulation of horror films made in 1980s Bombay. Vibhushan Subba teaches cinema studies at the School of Arts and Aesthetics at Jawaharlal Nehru University. His research focuses on marginal filmmaking practices, such as low-budget exploitation cinema, cult film studies, and digital fan cultures. He's currently working on a book manuscript on low-budget Bombay cinema of the B and C circuit. Before we begin, I'd like to share a few reminders for our audience members. Throughout the discussion and after, please feel free to share your questions and comments, anything that you may like to share in the Q&A box. This should be located on the bottom panel of your screen. We will open the discussion to the audience towards the end of the session, where I will gather all the questions that the speakers can then respond to collectively. We will also keep posting some relevant links and references in the chat box during the discussion, so do keep an eye out for those. I would now like to welcome Kartik and Vibhushan. Thank you so much for joining us today. Kartik, perhaps you may want to start off our discussion today by introducing Bombay horror of the 1980s. What was it exactly?
Great. Thank you so much, Arundhati and Aditya, for all your support today, as well as to ASAPath Connect for this invitation, and to Vibhushan for agreeing to participate in this conversation. I'm really looking forward to it. I'm going to keep my comments short, and actually, Arundhati said everything that I wanted to say, so maybe even shorter than I had planned to. But I have a presentation to share, so let me just pull that up. So as Arundhati just mentioned, my recently published book, Seeing Things, is about Hindi language horror films made in the Bombay film industry in 1980s India. And the book explores the production of these films and argues that a material history of their filmmaking or their production is palpable in and as the atmosphere that we call cinematic horror. Now, horror films are often described as atmospheric or as having atmosphere. They conjure immersive experiences of strange and surreal places and times. They do this to induce terror, anxiety, discomfort, disorientation, and disgust in the viewer. The many responses for which the genre is called horror, right, as an affective genre. Atmosphere in horror films names the ways in which these responses are generated by activating spaces, textures, things, bodies, and the medium of film itself via editing, sound, and camera movement. These elements and their choreography into an atmosphere work on us at a different frequency than, let's say, dialogue, character, or plot development. Consider a sequence from the 1984 Bombay horror film Purana Mandir, or Old Temple, directed by Shyam and Tulsi Ramsey. It's one of the case studies in the book. I'm going to describe the sequence for those of you who may not have seen the film. Inside a hospital emergency ward, a woman is giving birth to her first child. Outside the ward, her husband, the Thakur Ranveer Singh, worriedly paces the hall because something is wrong, right? His wife can be heard pleading, something is happening to me, I don't want to die, save me. And I'm just going to play the clip.
हरती, हरती, मुझे कुछ हो रहा है। तू ठीक तो हो ना? तू ठीक तो? मैं चाहती। डॉक्टर, डॉक्टर साहब, भारती, आप मुझे मत लो। भारती, डॉक्टर साहब। ठाकुर, नर्स, क्या हुआ डॉक्टर? क्या बात है डॉक्टर?
पता नहीं ठाकुर साहब, समझ में नहीं आता। आपकी पत्नी
भारती को क्या हुआ?
आप खुद जाकर देख लीजिए।
भारती, 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 क्या हुआ भारती?
In this sequence, Thakur Ranveer Singh experiences what he only knew as a whispered legend till then, that his family is cursed, that every woman in it will die painfully after giving birth to her first child. Atmospheric elements in this sequence may include the shadows of the window grates that darken the white tiles of the room, the billowing curtains we see occasionally, the lightning that strikes, and the clap of thunder that follows. Such elements make the curse feel real. The something that is happening to the mother also happens to the audience because a state of panic is conjured by the combination of sounds and images. In horror film studies, such atmosphere is typically interpreted in symbolic terms. And one of the things I'm hoping for in today's conversation is just to talk about interpretive modes in film scholarship and the methodological differences between reading the image along differential axes, right? In an article I wrote about 10 years ago, I argued that this sequence from Purana Mandir surfaces a repressed history of forced sterilization and family planning campaigns targeting women in 1980s India. At these family planning camps, women from urban and rural poor backgrounds were ushered into temporary clinics from which they emerged sterilized, often without having given full consent or understanding of the procedure. In April 1984, one news magazine sent a reporter to a local health center where 100 women were in line at a mass sterilization camp. The reporter noted, quote, "The smell of fear was tangible outside, where they lined up on the floor." And the report goes on, and I'm not going to quote, but in the popular imagination, forced sterilizations had transformed the clinic into a kind of black box where women could go in healthy, fertile, alive, but come out stricken, sterilized, or dead. Because the Indian government never acknowledged the violence of these campaigns, their aftershocks descended into the everyday lives of Indians and fed a range of superstition, anecdotes, and black humor. These genres intimated the violence of biopolitical rationality by conjuring rumors of castration, fertility disorders, and monstrous offspring. For its subaltern audiences, Purana Mandir unveiled the site of care as a site of abjection, torture, and certain death, which splits open the maternal body, splayed in a hospital bed and held down by nurses and doctors. But in returning to the hospital for the book, or 10 years after I first published something about it, I noticed other things. As the sequence begins, hanging on a wall of the hospital is a calendar, and it should be visible in the image I just pulled up. In the next shot of the same wall, the calendar is gone. The calendar reappears in another shot, but on a different wall, this time outside the emergency ward. Something strange is truly afoot in the scene of horror. What invisible force is moving the calendar? Of course, this is simply a continuity error, a lapse in the internal consistency of the presented story world. A continuity error should not surprise many of us who are regular film goers. Continuity errors abound in most industrial film production cultures and are especially visible in low-budget genres where production efficiency and speed are prioritized. By the early 1980s, India was the largest producer of films in the world, and many films were shot halfway or in shifts spread out over months or years. Some films were abandoned. As production boomed, ever greater numbers of workers entered film production and the Bombay film industry. And by 1984, film production was said to be employing somewhere close to 1 million workers a day, many of them in informal, seasonal, or daily wage positions. Now, speculating about who among these might have touched the calendar and when and why they might have done it transforms the calendar into a prop of sorts. Props are traditionally defined as objects touched by actors during the performance on stage. But thinking with the calendar as a prop in Purana Mandir can allow us to think of another film that's behind the scenes or between the scenes, the documentary kind of record of the film set being worked over by those most proximate to its background world rather than the foregrounded world of the story, right? Set assistants, carpenters, electricians, and extras. While Ranveer Singh and his wife struggle with the hand fate has dealt with them, two nurses attend on the scene in the background. Here they are. These nurses say nothing throughout the sequence. They are not perturbed by the horror. They don't scream. They barely exhibit any intuition that anything is wrong. If anything, they look tired, bored, or checked out. One nurse stares stonily at the mother. She perhaps even steals a glance at her watch. With little patience for the curse that spans centuries, these nurses seem out of time. They're not locked into the saga of this family, its story of generational trauma. Indeed, they seem to have no backstory or goals in the film, no past, no future. Their listless gestures suggest people stuck in a loop. They're just waiting for the mother to die, right? A few moments later, we will see the nurses just scramble out of the maternity ward, as you did see them, carelessly avoiding all eye contact with the Thakur on their way out. Where are they even going? Perhaps to their next movie assignment? For these are, of course, extras or junior or background artists as they were known. After mutely waiting on the mother to die, it might have been time for these extras to speed to their next filming job, which might have involved waiting on a friend as she's wed or dancing at a festival or observing a funeral. By the mid-80s, wages for extras in the Bombay film industry had plummeted as job opportunities even grew during the production boom. For decades, women extras in particular remained exposed to the predations of casting suppliers who picked them up from the gates outside of studios and transported them to film shoots outside the city. Growing discontent led to a series of strikes by background artists as the unions representing extras negotiated new rates of pay. And here we have some of the documents that were generated in the period around Purana Mandir in terms of the negotiations over payment for extras. Now, these Documents help us understand what work extras do, or as one document puts it, the junior artists who, quote, form part of crowds, mobs, groups, slum dwellers, dead bodies, or part of the ambiance in a college campus, unquote. Producers were adamant that no extra charge should be paid for an extra for clapping, for carrying small luggage, for standing below thigh deep water, or for speaking up to 5 words. Most interestingly for me, extras who spoke dialogue of 2 or 3 sentences, or whose faces prominently registered, that's the phrase from some of the documents, would be paid wages for an extra shift, so one whole extra shift. We can conclude that while extras supply necessary presence for convincing realist representation or spectacular form, their persistent figuration as supplements to the star, to the story, to foreground space is as much a financial calculation as it is an aesthetic decision. The fine gradations of payment over whether someone will speak more or less than 5 words, whether they clapped or not, whether their face is prominently registered or not, suggest that background artists or extras were engaged in exploitative corporeal work that transformed their persons into mere bodies. So the inculcated blankness of so many extras should remind us that the art of the background artist was to make no impression at all, is the phrase that I'm kind of quoting from these documents of negotiation, to make no impression, even if, quote, the camera happens to capture their close-up, unquote. Their job then is to give their faces to the camera while somehow remaining faceless. The cruel blankness of these nurses in Purana Mandir, even the wordlessness of the dying mother, is thus a kind of professional compulsion or perfection, right, arising from the conditions of their employment. But it also generates an imperfection within the scene of horror, an imperfection arising from that very compulsion to be invisible yet visible. Indifferent to the demands of generic affect or performance, to the pivotal scene of horror unfolding before them, the nurses look to the terror as though it were nothing. Nurses may save lives in hospitals, but extras depleted by their work also prepare the hospital for horror. Even as the moving images of Purana Mandir move the mother closer to death, the nurses remain nearly still. They are drained of and in turn drain the image of vitality. And extra work is sometimes called atmosphere work, and I'm interested in thinking more in my new project about the relations between the different meanings of atmosphere when we think of extras as doing atmosphere work. Attention to such background details by which atmosphere is piped into the scene, such as attention to background actors or objects, can reveal how forms of a failure to perform as expected can deepen the atmosphere of horror. How errant extras or animated objects like the calendar together conspire to rescript the scene of horror. Sensing film history in the scene of horror helps explain how bad performances or poor production values or continuity errors can populate a scene of horror and thereby induce an atmospheric experience of something going wrong. When it rotates into view as a film set, or when we begin to think of it as a film set, the scene of horror brings into view a film history not hidden by editing, framing, makeup, or glamour lighting. This is a very simple space that was redressed between shots to look like the inside and the outside of the same emergency ward. But because Purana Mandir only fitfully and kind of frugally recreates the popular iconography of a hospital, with the slightest appearance of white coats, medical trays, stethoscope, indifferent nurses, malfunctioning objects, the bareness of its hospital feels distressingly apt. Rather than only seeing a social, political, or cultural history of 1980s India allegorized into symbolic form, we can also see something else. For Purana Mandir shows us a material history of filmmaking in 1980s India, deposited as traces. The emergency ward becomes a scene of troubled labor, both fictional and real, and for that reason, it becomes doubly atmospheric. So I want to end here by saying that while I began by reading the sequence as a kind of allegory of biopolitical trauma, as the return of the repressed or forgotten history, in the book, my argument is that this repressed, in order to return on screen, must be expressed, right? And that expression happens materially, in, as, and through the cinematic medium. It returns via the work of production designers, makeup artists, actors, and other workers who must conjure its expression into the perceptual surface of the film. And my book is titled Seeing Things because I pay closer attention to aspects of this surface and how they were physically crafted. in doing so, I sense a different kind of repressed returning in the atmosphere of horror, a material history of filmmaking in 1980s India that creates this atmospheric effect that we call cinematic horror. So I'll stop here and happy to take this forward in conversation.
Thank you so much, Kartik. That was such a wonderful introduction into some of the many things I'm sure that are going to come up in our subsequent discussions. And I really like the idea of a time and industry that's, caught in being able to read them through these failures as a connective tissue almost. Vibhushan, I would like to, perhaps you might want to add on to some of these aspects in your work, looking at the sphere of the low budget and sometimes precarious productions. Please.
Yeah, thank you. I'd like to thank Arundhati and Aditya and ASAP Connect for putting this together, and Kartik, of course, and also like to congratulate him on this fantastic book, which which intricately, through extensive archival research, firsthand personal interviews, and close reading, sets the scene of Bombay horror in the 80s. So congratulations, Kartik. I'm just going to do a very brief overview of what's happening in Bombay horror in the 80s, and hopefully get to the fandom part if I have enough time. Yeah. So in the 70s and 80s, the world of horror is sort of experiencing some changes. These were also years when, horror special effects came into its own. And so, like group of, special effect artists like Dick Smith, Rick Baker, Chris Wallace, Tom Savini, amongst others, were doing great work and, received a lot of attention and respect for their art. So, horror special effects then moves from a subcultural sort of, terrain to more mainstream. And it sort of becomes a large part of the cultural discussions in the 70s and 80s. Simultaneously, we can also see, like in the slide, there is the rise of, fanzines like Fangoria and Cine Fantastic, which were largely invested in, special effects. And so they ran exhaustive like stories on special effects, etc. Ernest Matthias tracks this in his article. And so and during the 80s, we can see that there is a certain professionalization of special effects that is taking place within the horror industry. So what this does is changes the narratives in a certain way, in the sense that it also allows special effects to become the central, to hold a central place in the narratives. So, for example, films like Evil Dead, etc., pivots around, special effects of blood and gore, etc. And so it's not just limited to narratives, but it's also plays a major part in terms of promotion and publicity material. So this particular scene, the head explosion scene in Scanners, becomes the main sort of thing, like in publicity and campaign in around the film. And so like special effects becomes, a professionalized, there's a certain sense of professionalization in the 80s, by the end of the 80s. And so jumping to Bombay horror, there is a similar sort of movement happening also in Bombay horror, where, the horror films of the 80s sort of departs from the earlier cycle of like, Gothic supernaturals. From introducing, like, from moving away from like, supernatural apparitions or psychological tricks and twists of fate to more, to the addition of the monster, right? The figure of the monster plays a very important role in this transformation, in the sense it sort of changes the Gothic itself or mutates the Gothic itself. And so this addition, of the monster and so offers this palpable terrors and anxieties of the body, the monstrous body, and all of these visceral thrills, like, which comes along with it. And you can see the monster squad here, right from Samri to Nikita to the mummy in Dark Bungalow on your left, to of course Count Nevla, right, from Darwaza. So So at the heart of the Ramsey film is the idea of a crime. So there is an inextricable association of a crime and a burial, right? And this happens across their filmography, like from Purana Mandir to Purani Haveli to Tehkhana, to Hotel, and so on and so forth. And so what this does, there is a certain sense of something being buried, like a secret being buried. And along with the monster brings its own locale or environment. And there are certain cavernous spaces like the Tehkhana that you can see in this particular slide. In the upper part of the thing, that is Purani Haveli, and then the lower thing is Purana Mandir. So there are these cavernous spaces which becomes very important. And the Tehkhana then becomes not only a stand-in for a grave, becomes a crypt, it becomes a basement, it becomes a site of contestation, it becomes a site of repressed desires. But it also reflects on these buried histories of India's, relationship with its, multiple pasts, and also resonates with the horror genre itself in India, which emerged on the margins of the main film, the mainstream film industry. So, which occupies the space of the underbelly, yeah, which is the ignored object. And so now moving on to, like, this is from all of these cavernous spaces of the Tehkhana and Dark Bangla, etc. And so opening a trapdoor to other low budget filmmakers. So while the Ramsays are exiting the scene at the end of the 80s, there is another set of brothers this time too, Kanti and Kishan Shah, who's entering or setting off in the low budget journey, right? And so they are these two figures who've cut their teeth in the subterranean world of small budget films. And so starting in the early 90s, Kanti Shah is making all of these dacoit films, and then he jumps from genre to genre, like from horror to eventually settling on erotica and sexploitation, etc. Through the 90s. And why I'm talking about his films in particular is this one particular film by Kanti Shah, which is sort of crucial in the emergence of cult fandom in India, right? So the year is 1998, and so Kanti Shah releases two films. One is Moth, which is a horror film, as you can see here. And Moth becomes a runaway hit in the small budget world, according to his own, according to Kanti Shah himself. And it also puts a lot of pressure on the processing lab called the Rocco Labs, which is equipped to handle only like a few prints. But since Moth is a big hit, so they have to produce like some 20 to 30 prints, so it gets overwhelmed, right? Like this is Kanti Shah talking about Moth. And so Moth becomes a hit. And the other film that he releases, in the 90s is in 1998 is Gunda, right? Which with Mithun Chakravarti in the lead, and it is a revenge story which nuzzles the familiar territory of the Bombay underworld, with dialogues delivered in verse and like an eclectic mix of villains, right? But Gunda just comes into the theaters, and then it faces some trouble with censorship, and it swiftly migrates to the interiors, and it's quickly forgotten, right? Now many years have passed. Like in the early years of the millennium, the B movies, the industry itself is in its twilight zone, because things have changed. The multiplexes have come in, so the B movie industry is in a predicament, in the sense the multiplexes won't have them, and the single screens can't screen them because they're like rapidly folding, right? So in this particular, so in the early, so Gunda is long forgotten, and so when it comes back in the early years of the millennium, it comes back on IMDb as the highest rated film, right? So passing even films like Shawshank Redemption and The Godfather. And this was largely due to the voting campaigns done by students in IIT throughout India, possibly starting from IIT Kharagpur. And simultaneously, there is in 2007, Arnav Ray, who goes by Great Bomb, does this review of Gunda in his blog called The Random Thoughts of a Demented Mind. And it spreads like wildfire. There's like, sharing, there's downloading. So there's like a huge circulation of this particular film. This is some of the comments on that blog post. Yeah. And so the film itself, has this very unexpected journey in a sense, like, traveling at the edges of distribution, popping up in, footpath stalls, video parlors, tent cinemas, and then appearing online towards this, in this, networks environment of social media. And so, but this particular blog is not the only catalyst, which is to propel this cult film fandom. And then there is a lot of Gunda merchandise, posters, etc., remakes, fan remakes, etc. But at the same time, there are these other collectors and archivists who are uploading during the same time in the mid 2000s, uploading films on YouTube, like Asim Chandavar. So Asim Chandavar was on different channels, like his channel on YouTube is Niluli. That he is Baba Jogeshwari on Instagram now, Gina Kolkar in Twitter, etc. So he started uploading these films, horror, exploitation, all low genres, etc., on his channel through mobile phones, like, when this technology was not very sophisticated. So he had like bad quality prints. But then there was a sort of a competition because there were other collectors like Legit Freak, or Saket Gadkari, who were like, who would get their hands on Son of Dracula, which, Asim wouldn't have. So there was a healthy competition that was like, brewing. So, and at the same time, you have in 2007, you have, this page called, the Facebook page called I Love Trashy Hindi Movies, which started with a few thousand members and now has around some 38,000 members, which is, page is an eclectic collection of old posters, trivia information, production stills, magazine excerpts, clips, memes, GIFs, anything that is related to trashy Hindi movies, as the title declares. And the description says, if you love mindless, absurd, B-grade, obscure, trashy, and all kinds of Hindi movies, then this is the group. Yeah, so this is some of the people commenting on, like, the horror films. And I'll come back to this if I have time. But so there are, with the growth of this emergence of this fandom, there is also transnational alliances. And then you have a lot of thing on international popular press. Like, for example, you had, a lot of material coming out, like, for example, in Teleport City or the Cultural Gutter, or magazines like the Diabolique and the Weng's Chop, etc. Here, Keith Allison is reviewing a film of Harinam Singh's, like, Shaitani Dracula, right? And then Weng's Chop comes up with this particular issue, which is the inspiration behind the Sapna Sapu, which is one of the leading ladies of Kantisha films. And then in 2011, Finders Keepers releases Bollywood Bloodbath, which is a record compiling the soundtracks from the depths of Bombay horror, right? And then you have certain acknowledgements in the Indian industry, like, for example, in Udan, you have these kids who skip school to watch Kantisha Zangur and get expelled, I think. And then you have Ashu Maluwalia, who's also a self-confessed B-movie fan and a member of the I Love Trashy Hindi Movies. He produces Miss Lovely, and then there is, Shaitan Haveli, which is inspired by the Ramsey aesthetics. And then recently you have Cinema Marte Dantak, which is a Vice sort of a documentary on, and recently you have Mondo Macabro came out with this limited edition Blu-ray thing with 6 titles. Yeah. So I think I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Vibhushan, for that fascinating overview. I think between both your presentation, Kartik and Vibhushan's, it gives us such a wonderful sense of lives and afterlives of Bombay horror, especially as a genre that's traditionally not been considered within not just mainstream, academia, but also in terms of viewership. Even I feel like even when someone talks about things like nostalgia, something that people are looking at the 70s and the 80s, this is an area that's often relegated to the trashy part of cinephilia. So I think it's very interesting then to consider its very emergence and its existence within the purview of something like censorship, for example. So before I sort of ask my slightly perhaps maybe convoluted question, I just want to remind the audience that if we do have one question already, but if anyone has any questions or comments they'd like to share, please feel free to do so in the Q&A box. And after I ask my question, I'll sort of move on to the audience. So the floor is open for questions. I was just wondering, censorship, of course, plays a very central role when it comes to, just the history of cinema itself. Kartik, for instance, in Seeing Things, you sort of begin the book by talking about censorship itself. And then, there is an idea that what is restrictive informs the aesthetic to some sense, and then, of course, it informs the material conditions of making such films. So, I was just wondering that precisely through these ideas of omission and manipulation, the failures or the gaps that come in when you try and work around these censorship regimes, perhaps you might want to speak a little bit more about that idea and how this idea of censorship informed your own historiographic and archival work. Similarly, Vibhushan, I wonder if you would want to speak a bit about how censorship then affects this tracing or retracing of post-release cinephilia, like things that come back, whether they're archived, even in a space like YouTube is very volatile, accounts do shut down very often. I know I've archived certain films that those accounts just don't exist anymore. And then some of them are struck down by copyright claims. A lot of them are struck down by just, obscenity or other such concerns. So, just a twofold question. So either of you, however you may want to address those.
Sure, I can go first. So is the question about the role of censorship informing this kind of atmospheric
Yes.
experience of horror. So in the book, the first 2 chapters actually examine censorship and its relationship to horror. And what I do is I spend some time with the documents around film censorship and the opening of the Bombay horror film cycle in the late 70s. And so chapter 1 is about paperwork and the management of India's first horror film, as the Ramsay brothers advertised, Darwaza. But chapter 2 moves away from paperwork and the documentary archive to examine the film itself as an archive of its own censorship. And what I mean by that is I spend a lot of time with celluloid damage that's visible throughout the film Jani Dushman, which is a film many of you may be familiar with. It plays on TV quite frequently. And this is a big budget, a multi-star horror film. And for that reason, may have attracted other kinds of censorship than, let's say, a Ramsay Brothers film did. And the chapter began with my feeling like I was watching an incomplete film, because whenever the moment of horror would seem to approach climax, it felt like the film itself would shudder. There was noise in the image, there were scratches that were visible, and I felt like images were also missing. And so one of the interesting kind of maybe discoveries of this case study is understanding how extensive the forced deletions from the film were, but also then understanding how the rushed nature or the kind of non-consensual nature of the removal of these images produces a film that kind of incorporates its own experience of being violated into what we call the atmosphere of horror, right? So even if the image of death goes missing in Jani Dushman, celluloid seems to be in pain in those moments of death. So there's a kind of transfer from the fictional story world of mortality to an experience of the materiality of celluloid. Like celluloid is under persecution or under threat in that film. And so I was building there on the work of existing censorship scholars, Lotte Hook, Monica Mehta, Lalita Gopal, to think about how the kind of infrastructure of censorship becomes expressive in these moments, right? Vibhushan?
So in terms of, I think there's something which is largely associated with, exploitation, B-circuit, etc., is the idea of a film which is never a finished object, right? It's always in a state of alteration. So I remember, like in the early stages of research, when I was doing my PhD, I was watching this film called Bedroom by Kartik Nair, and I just finished writing a couple of, a thing on that particular film, like a close reading. And then I think I'd lost the VCD through, on which I was watching the film. And then I found the film again on YouTube, and then it was a completely different film. Like, the scene was like completely different. So I think largely cut pieces and splices also played an important role, whether it was in terms of censorship, etc., because during exhibition, a lot of things were, spliced into the reel. Yeah. And so, and I think that similar thing remains with the YouTube archives, because then sometimes it disappears and it appears in some other in some other spaces, right? And I'll quickly also answer this question from Bhavya, who's asked how widespread is this fan subculture when it comes to B-grade films getting second lease, and who are these fans? So largely, the fans, there was a difference in the sense, like the people who were watching the early 80s horror was a certain kind of audience, right? Like, because they were screening in this single screen theaters, most of which were like grubby theaters or interior circuits. So the audience constitution then was in the single screen theaters. In the metropolitans were largely also migrant labor population, and then towards the 90s and the early 2000s, in a Facebook page like I Love Trashy Hindi Movies, the audience thing has changed in the sense, like now it's engineers, doctors, researchers, academics, filmmakers. The admin, I think, is an ad film or a film production, like creative head. This is how the audiences have changed over the years.
We have quite a few questions from the audience, so I'm very quickly going to move on to those. Srishti Valia has a question for Kartik. I especially liked how you link atmosphere to junior artists, to the political legal contract of workers with production houses, and how in turn that affects their gestures on screen, which lead to a layer of terrorizing atmosphere in the 80s Hindi horror. Would you mind elaborating a bit more, giving perhaps one more example apart from the nurses?
Sure. Thanks, Srishti, for that question, and thanks for your comments. There are other examples in the book. It's my pitch for you to get a copy. But one of the things I will say is that in the book, I spent some time developing the idea of the political and legal environment around the FWICE, which is the largest union representing below-the-line workers in the Bombay film industry, and how these negotiations may or may not be felt in the atmosphere of horror, right? So whether you can feel for the kind of the political intransigence of set dressers in the way in which a prop moves or doesn't move, right? It's a kind of speculative approach to thinking with who was on the set that day. But one of the things that I've become interested in since publishing the book is thinking more broadly with the role of extras in creating cinematic atmosphere. And so maybe it's useful then to compare across genres or productions. And so while the argument I'm making for a low budget horror film is that the indifference of the extras, which might be seen like a failure to perform correctly, right, within the demands of the genre, actually ends up serving the atmosphere because they seem indifferent to terror, right? And so ends up kind of fulfilling something ominous about the hospital, right, as a space that fails to provide care. That argument might shift if I turn my attention to a film like Gandhi, right? And that's the work that I've become more interested in recently. This is a big budget Indian-British co-production of the same period, famously hired the largest number of extras ever assembled for a film for many different locations across India. And one of the things that I'm interested in there is thinking about how the very demand to not give your face to the camera rubs up against the need of the film to produce a unified mass that has no face and gives itself completely to the cause of decolonization and the leadership of Gandhi, right? And so the film has many kind of surging crowd shots where hundreds of thousands of extras have been assembled. You shouldn't be able to see their faces, but almost in every shot in which the crowd control has directed them to look at Gandhi, which is Ben Kingsley arriving, let's say, within the scene, you'll see a few extras turned away and looking directly at the camera, right? And so I've become interested in then thinking of a different meaning of disobedience, right? Not so much within the context of like a film about the decolonial period, but disobedience within the context of the 80s film industry, right? And how then that aligns or doesn't align with the kind of standard reading of the film.
And Shishi had a question for Vibhushan as well. I was wondering if you could elaborate a little more on how the 90s fared after the decline of the Ramses when it came to B cinema, and what kind of picture do they paint of this period that extends to the early 2000s?
So could you repeat the last part?
Sure. If you could elaborate a little bit more on how the 90s fare after the decline of the Ramses when it came to B cinema, and what kind of picture do they paint of this period that extends to the early 2000s?
Thanks. So largely in the 90s, like I was saying, it's also it's much the Ramses were playing with a certain sort of budget, right, which is substantial for a B, like in a B production, right? Like so in the 90s, there's like falling levels of investment. So there's like lesser and lesser budgets available to people, and so people like Kanti Shah, and then later on, like Harinam Singh, etc., working on very, very micro budgets. And so, of course, that sort of leads to a certain sense of drop in terms of production values, right? So instead of, Kartik will, I think, probably speak about this. I wanted to ask this as a question, but I'm just going to tie this in the sense, like, he talks about how the Ramses, reach out to Christopher Tucker, the Elephant Man, to create the mask, or Srinivas Roy, how he creates the thing in Virana. So those kind of budgets, I think, are not available in the 90s and the early 2000s. And so, so there is, so usually for example, in a Harinam Singh film, you would find a person with a Halloween mask or any other mask, which passes off as the monster. Right, so falling levels of investment, and largely there is in the early 2000s there is a move from horror to sexploitation. So all of these erotica sort of films are being produced by Kanti Shah and other filmmakers, and so there is a change in that genre, and which I think persists to date. I mean, it's mostly also through mobile phones, apps, etc., that all of the sexploitation films are traveling. Yeah, but Kartik, could you also, if you find time later, could you speak to that particular thing? I mean, more about the special effects.
Okay. So we had a question from Apurva for Kartik. Can you tell us a little bit about your use of the term Bombay horror and what specifically sets it apart from other industries on circuits or networks of horror cinema in the subcontinent?
Thanks, Apurva. So my delimitation of these as Bombay horror films has to do with a few different parameters. These are films made in the Bombay film industry. These are Hindi language films. Their first and primary market is Bombay Film City, or that 127 theaters that were then built in the city, and the specifically, as Vibhushan was describing, certain theaters in working class neighborhoods being the primary market. They were also censored primarily at the Bombay office of the censor board. So I think of them as Bombay films, not only in that they kind of play with the idioms of the cinema we know as Bombay cinema, but quite literally in where they are grounded in their production economy, ecology, and the kind of eventual circulation. It's typically after they have played in the Bombay film market that their prints then travel, right? And in the book, I spent some time towards the end in chapter 5 on circulation with thinking about what happens to a print as it travels and how damage from traveling prints then becomes part of the kind of the experience of degradation and noise in horror. This is not an argument that hinges on the uniqueness of Bombay horror. In fact, my argument is meant to be suggestive about different ways to read the materiality of film in general, right? And so I'm very hopeful that this is part of a broader shift within Indian film studies, certainly, towards acknowledging the kind of corporeality of film, the materiality of its production, and the role that this kind of physicality plays in constituting the filmic, right? It's just, it comes from a certain reaction to what film studies has equipped us to talk about when we are watching the image. So it is very much an argument that I hope is suggestive and open-ended, and I see it as being part of a kind of broader range of new work, whether we're thinking of Darshana Sridhar's work on low-budget or mid-budget pornography and erotic genres, my work on horror, Debashir Mukherjee's work on cine ecology, Usha Iyer's work on kind of the corporeality of film dance. This is not a genre-specific argument, and yet I find that the more time you spend with the image, it raises then specific implications for the genre you're studying, right? And so the analysis of materiality will hinge or matter differently to analysis of film dance than it might to an analysis of filmic horror.
And we actually also have a question from Debashri for Kartik. Can you speak a bit about your historiographic and narrative style in the book? You make these seamless moves from material visible evidence to very suggestive or speculative plot points, such as where the extras went from the hospital room, possibly to the picket line. Can you talk a bit about this very conscious writing choice?
Thanks, Debashri. Thank you for noting something about the writing style. I wish I had said they went from the hospital room to the picket line. That would have been a more forceful kind of articulation of what remains speculative in the book. I would say that one of the things this slightly adventurous writing style is trying to do is fill the gaps between the different archives that are available, right? So there's what I can see in the film, and there's what I know from, let's say, trade journals about negotiation. There are Bombay City newspapers that are tracing a certain history, and then there's the oral narratives that I collected. But there are gaps between them, between what they seek to remember, what they remember, and how they remember and choose to remember. And what any of these very medium-specific archives can remember, right? And so for me to suggest that the nurses are going from taking care of the mother in Purana Mandir to maybe the picket line is hoping that the reader will follow me on a kind of suggestive way to think about or unbracket the film text. You use the word seamless. This is a word that has kind of strong valence in film studies because so much of our theory of narrative, immersion, and the story world emerges from a kind of 70s moment in film studies of theorizing a particular kind of well-made Hollywood film, which has no seams, right? And it so happens that I was trained in that discipline before I watched many of these films. And so my experience of the films as having seams is not only or not even so much an experience of them showing their seams as me experiencing certain kinds of failures based on my own training in kind of a normative film studies and a normative kind of horror film. So this, I think, goes beyond your question, but I remain invested in thinking more with the idea of the seamy, right? Whether that's in the film text, whether that's in my experience of the film, and then maybe using a writing style that both acknowledges the seam, right, this gap, but also tries to move us through it.
Thank you. And we had a couple of more questions for Vibhushan. To what extent have B-grade horror films influenced the evolution and current landscape of Bollywood cinema?
I think the films, the Bombay, the horror of the 80s itself also draws inspiration from a wide, sort of cauldron. And so, there are bits of the Italian giallo films that comes through. There is some of American horror, like, Evil Dead. So, and then the Ramsey universe then turns it into something which is unique, like in the sense of their own blend, right? And so this travels, I mean, I don't know if there's a direct relationship to modern horror in how it is being, how it is influenced. But I think one of the major things is, like Kartik was also talking about, is like these films also move through atmospheric clusters, right? More than being propelled by narrative or plot, or character psychology, etc. And so in recent times, I think I was just watching Brahm, the the TV series, right? And some of these TV series that have emerged, and a lot of of them are experimenting with landscapes. Most of them are set in these small kill towns, and then there is a lot of sort of play with atmospheric clusters, in the sense, like with the weather. But that's one part of, like, I think some sort of inspiration that was. But the other thing is also, like for example, Shaitan Haveli draws heavily from the 80s, like, cinema, which is it's like heavily inspired, right? Like the main character probably is called Hariman, I think, but it's probably derived from Harinam Singh, right? So and it has that kind of aesthetic also, right? Uses that the use of low-key lighting to advance, like, malevolent sort of atmospheres, like, which is like usually in the Ramsey films, it's when it comes to this atmosphere of malevolence, that is when they use low-key lighting with lurid gels, right? Like thrown in a good measure. But the rest of the film is then again shot in daylight, and there is, which is like rather flat lighting, except for a few scenes, like for example in Virana, there is a scene, a song sequence, in which they experiment with a graduated filter, color filter, right? So yeah, I guess that.
And we had another question from Ishita. It's not addressed to anyone in particular, but so I do think the both of you should answer this. How do you look at the atmosphere in terms of these horror movie posters, or generally, how would you read horror movie posters? So kind of like the extended archive beyond the film.
I think Vibhushan will be able to say more about this. For anyone who's interested, Ian Robert Smith has done a lot of work on film posters, I think posters are very suggestive for marketing strategies, and for how different they may appear than the films that they're advertising. One of the arguments I make in the book is just following posters for the films can tell us the increasing importance of the location of the Haveli. in kind of 80s films, how foregrounded they are in the narrative and visual world, and how therefore tracking the changes in the poster can tell us a little bit about changes in the kind of iconography of Bombay horror. But Vibhushan, I'm going to let you speak.
No, I think Karthik's already answered that, but I guess the posters also played a central role in the sense that they changed from one particular place to the other, right? Like, so they were like targeted space-specific posters in the sense, like in certain spaces, they would have a completely different poster, which would have, and trying to exploit sort of like, the audience step. I mean, sort of feeling the audience temperature in different spaces. And so the posters themselves, like the films, changed from one space to the other.
Yeah, and I just want to add that in addition to posters sometimes featuring visual elements that had nothing to do with the story once you found the film, I have a poster of Purana Mandir that features the Grim Reaper. The Grim Reaper never appears in the film. But the other thing that's interesting about some of these posters and some of the discourse around horror film posters in the 70s and 80s in newspapers is how much sometimes they would feature images that would end up censored out of the film itself. Because there are different rules for censorship of posters. And the MIB had certain guidelines that were not implemented in the same way as for films, right? And so you'd get this kind of fetishized still of violence or monstrosity in the poster, and that same image may not appear. Right? So it's also then the poster becomes a very nice kind of counter record of what the film used to be at some point, right? Even if it's becoming a promise of what the film promises to be. So
Thank you so much. I think because we have also run out of time, we're well above the 60-minute, that we had initially planned this discussion to be. We do have a few more questions, but we'll have to close the session for now. And I think both Kartik and Vibhushan will be happy to get to those perhaps over email. I can collect their responses and share them as well if you'd like to get in touch with us. So with that, I'd like to thank Vibhushan and Kartik again for taking us through this very important yet fascinating perspective on Bombay horror, cinema of the 80s, and the ways in which we approach them today. So thank you again. And for everyone, we please follow us on Instagram or, join our mailing list if you'd like to keep up with the kind of writing and conversations we have on ASAP. A recording of today's talk will be up on the app as well very soon. So do keep an eye out for that. And yeah, with that, thank you again. And I hope everyone has a good evening and a good day.
And thank you, Arundhati. Thank you, Aditya. And thank you, Vibhushan. And thanks everybody for showing up. This was excellent. I hope you all.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.